In the brutal final year of World War II in Europe, German commanders in the mountains of Italy were staging a desperate last stand. They were up against a multinational Allied force pushing relentlessly north. But in the autumn of 1944, strange reports started trickling in about a new enemy on the front lines, an enemy that spoke Portuguese. Where on earth did they come from? They were from a continent over 6,000 miles away, from a nation most soldiers had never even thought about. They were from Brazil. The German high command was baffled. Their Allied counterparts were skeptical. And yet, by the war's end, this improbable army would pull off one of the most stunning victories of the entire Italian campaign. The capture of the German 148th Infantry Division and their Italian allies, haul of nearly 15,000 Axis soldiers, including 2 generals. This is the story of how the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, an army that wasn't even supposed to exist, defied all expectations and carved its name into history. This is the story of the Smoking Cobras. So, how did 25,000 Brazilians end up fighting in the mountains of Italy? To get that, we have to go back to the start of the war. Brazil, under its complex, authoritarian leader Getúlio Vargas, was playing a very dangerous game. Vargas had set up a quasi-fascist state called the Estado Novo and was a public admirer of Mussolini, all while keeping strong economic ties with Nazi Germany. For the first few years of the war, Brazil stayed officially neutral, expertly juggling trade with both the Axis and the Allies. But geography made neutrality a tough sell. The Natal Bulge, the easternmost point of the Americas, was a place that kept American generals up at night. If the Axis controlled it, they could launch operations across the South Atlantic. But in Allied hands, it was a vital springboard for flying aircraft, supplies, and troops to the battlefronts in North Africa and beyond. The United States, pushing its good neighbor policy, began an intense campaign of diplomacy and economic pressure to win Brazil over. President Vargas, a master politician, saw his chance. While keeping up his neutral act in public, he was cutting deals with the U.S. behind the scenes. Vargas knew he held a valuable card, and he was going to play it for all it was worth. In 1940, a huge deal was struck. In exchange for strategic cooperation, the U.S. would finance the construction of the Volta Redonda steel mill. This wasn't just any factory. It was a massive industrial project that would become the cornerstone of Brazil's modern economy. A year later, Brazil signed on to the Lend-Lease Agreement, opening the floodgates for American military aid. The scales were tipping. Brazil was still officially neutral, but its allegiance was slowly being bought and paid for. The final push that threw Brazil into the war didn't come from a diplomat's pen. It came from the fiery explosion of a torpedo after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Brazil sided with the United States at the Pan American Conference in January 1942 and cut all diplomatic ties with Germany, Italy, and Japan. Berlin's response was swift and savage. German and Italian U-boats, already hunting Allied shipping, turned their periscopes toward Brazil's merchant fleet. Throughout 1942, they unleashed a relentless submarine campaign in the South Atlantic. One by one, Brazilian ships were sent to the bottom. In a series of horrifying attacks in August 1942, a single U-boat, U-507, sank 5 Brazilian vessels in just 2 days, killing over 600 civilians. The news sent a shock wave of outrage across Brazil. Furious crowds flooded the streets of Rio de Janeiro and other cities, demanding revenge. The pressure on Vargas was immense. His delicate balancing act was over. On August 22, 1942, Brazil formally declared war on Germany and Italy. For nearly 2 years, Brazil's main contribution was hunting U-boats in the Atlantic. And they were remarkably good at it, helping secure vital sea lanes. But for Vargas, that wasn't enough. To truly guarantee Brazil a seat at the post-war table, he needed to make a mark on the main stage. He needed to send an army to Europe. Declaring war is one thing. Creating an army that can go toe-to-toe with the German Wehrmacht is something else entirely. The whole idea seemed so ridiculous that it led to a popular saying in Brazil. It's more likely for a snake to smoke a pipe than for the BEF to go to the front and fight. It was the 1940s way of saying when pigs fly. The men of the newly formed Brazilian Expeditionary Force, or FEB, loved the insult. They leaned into it, creating a now legendary divisional patch. A green snake, calmly smoking a pipe. They would be the Cobras Fumantes, the Smoking Cobras. Putting together this force of 25,000 men was a monumental challenge. The Brazilian military, traditionally based on the French model, had to be completely overhauled and retrained to fight like the Americans. They were issued American M1 Garand rifles, wore American uniforms, and even ate American rations. Imagine going from the tropical beaches of Rio to training for a blizzard in a country you've only read about. It was a shock to say the least. In July 1944, the first 5,000 Brazilian soldiers arrived in Naples, Italy. They were walking into one of the most punishing theaters of the war. The Italian campaign was a slow, agonizing crawl up a peninsula of mountains, mud, and some of the toughest defensive lines ever built. The Brazilians, led by General João Baptista Mascarenhas de Moraes, were attached to the U.S. Fifth Army. Nobody, not the Americans, not the Germans, and maybe not even the Brazilians themselves, knew what was about to happen. The Smoking Cobra was about to be tested by fire. The Italy that greeted the Brazilians was a meat grinder. Allied advance had slammed to a halt at the infamous Gothic Line, a massive belt of German fortifications that stretched coast to coast across the jagged peaks of the northern Apennine Mountains. It was a hellscape of concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery, all manned by veteran German troops ready to fight for every single rock. The Feb was thrown into this inferno in September 1944. Their first few actions were successful, as they captured towns like Mazzarosa and Camaiore, but as they pushed deeper into the mountains, the brutal Italian winter set in. Progress slowed to a crawl. These men, many of whom had never seen snow, were now fighting in freezing cold and relentless rain. They suffered terribly from frostbite and trench foot. Morale hit rock bottom. Their main target was a mountain that would become a symbol of Brazilian sacrifice, Monte Castelo. This fortified peak was a key anchor in the German line, and had already beaten back attacks from more experienced Allied units. Between November 1944 and February 1945, the FEB launched a series of desperate assaults on the mountain, only to be thrown back again and again by a storm of German machine gun and mortar fire. The slopes became a graveyard, but they didn't break. Reorganizing and resupplying, the Brazilians planned one last all-out attack. On February 21, 1945, after a massive artillery barrage, the Smoking Cobras charged up the slopes one more time. This time, they fought with a cold fury, driving the German defenders from their bunkers. After 12 hours of brutal close-quarters combat, the Brazilian flag was raised over the summit of Monte Castelo. They had done what others could not, breaking a critical point in the Gothic line and finally earning the respect of their American allies and the fear of their German enemies. The victory at Monte Castelo was a turning point, proving the incredible resilience of an army everyone had underestimated. But their story only gets more amazing from here. If you're finding the forgotten history of the Smoking Cobras as fascinating as we do, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our future dives into the unsung heroes of history. While the infantry was bleeding in the mountains, another group of Brazilians was fighting a different war in the skies above. The 1st Fighter Squadron of the Brazilian Air Force, known by their war cry Senta APA, which loosely translates to hit 'em hard, was proving to be one of the most ruthlessly efficient units in the theater. Flying American P-47D Thunderbolt fighter bombers, the Brazilian pilots roared into combat in October 1944. They were small in number, but their impact was huge. Think about this. They flew just 5% of the total air missions in their operational theater, but were responsible for destroying an incredible 85% of enemy ammunition dumps, 36% of fuel depots, and 28% of the targeted bridges in their sector. They were punching far, far above their weight. On a single day, April 22, 1945, during the final Allied spring offensive, the squadron flew 44 individual missions, wiping out over 80 German military vehicles and shattering the enemy's frantic retreat. Their relentless attacks created chaos in the German rear, cutting off reinforcements and supplies from the front and directly helping the Allied ground troops advance. Back on the ground, the fall of Monte Castelo had opened the floodgates. With the Gothic line broken for good, the Allied forces surged into the Po Valley in the spring of 1945. The German army in Italy was shattered, disorganized and in a full-blown retreat. For the smoking cobras, who had suffered through the static misery of the winter, it was finally a war of movement, and they were about to corner their prey. As the final days of April 1945 ticked by, the war in Italy was reaching its endgame. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force, advancing rapidly, spotted a huge mass of German forces trying to escape north from the collapsing front. These weren't just scattered leftovers. This was the bulk of the German 148th Infantry Division, along with several Italian fascist divisions. They were trapped near the town of Fornovo di Taro. What happened next was brilliant. The Brazilians didn't just chase the Germans, they outran them, seizing the critical town of Collecchio and blocking the escape route. A desperate battle kicked off. The Germans, commanded by General Otto Pico, a veteran of the Eastern Front, tried to smash through the Brazilian lines, but were beaten back at every turn. Completely surrounded by the Feb elements of the American 92nd Infantry Division and Italian partisans, General Pico realized the situation was hopeless. On April 29, 1945, a German delegation approached the Brazilian lines under a white flag to negotiate a surrender. General Pico gave up his entire command to the Brazilian General Mascara and Hasta Moraes. Over the next few hours, an incredible scene unfolded as a sea of Axis soldiers laid down their weapons. The final count was staggering. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force had captured the entire German 148th Division and the remnants of several Italian divisions. Taking nearly 15,000 prisoners, including 2 generals, the German Otto Pico and the Italian Mario Carloni. It was the only time during the entire Italian campaign that a German division surrendered intact to an Allied force. Just 2 days later, all remaining Axis forces in Italy capitulated. When the war in Europe ended just days after their great victory, the 25,000 men of the FEB had achieved the impossible. They had fought and bled in one of the war's toughest campaigns, suffering 948 combat deaths across all services to secure their objectives. They were hailed as heroes by the Italian towns they liberated and respected by their enemies for their sheer tenacity. During the campaign, they took a staggering total of 20,573 Axis prisoners. Their return to Brazil, however, was bittersweet. President Vargas, the same man who sent them to war, was now worried about their prestige and the democratic ideals they had absorbed fighting alongside the Allies. Fearing the popular general Mascara and Hasta Moraes as a political threat, Vargas quickly moved to disband the FEB, preventing them from marching as a unified, victorious army. The heroes were celebrated by the people but sidelined by their own government. Despite this complicated homecoming, the legacy of the FEB is profound. Their success on the battlefield boosted Brazil's international standing, helped establish it as a key military power in South America, and forged a deep alliance with the United States that would shape the Cold War. For Brazil itself, the FEB became a powerful symbol of national pride, courage, and perseverance. To this day, in the small towns of the Italian Apennines they helped free, the memory of the smoking cobras is honored. Memorials are cared for, ceremonies are held, and the people have never forgotten the soldiers from a distant, tropical land who came to fight for their freedom. The story of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force is about an army that defied every single expectation. They were born from a political gamble and mocked by a popular saying that it was more likely for a snake to smoke than for them to ever see combat. They were trained in a hurry and thrown into one of the most brutal fronts of the war, against an enemy that had conquered a continent. And yet, in the mud and snow of the Italian mountains, they fought with a courage that shocked their allies and broke their enemies. They took Monte Castello when no one else could. Their pilots became legends. They ended their campaign by capturing an entire enemy army corps in a single brilliant move. The men of the FEB proved that the snake would not only fight, but it would triumph. In the mountains of Italy, against all odds, the cobra did in fact smoke. Thanks for watching.